How's it going, everyone? Welcome to another video of the course. Now, as requested, I am making a video on how you should use a ChoCh, and I'm going to be diving into when and where you should be marking your ChoChs. Alright, so let's just start with a basic of what a ChoCh looks like. So I'm going to quickly draw out one. Now, a ChoCh is when your high, so let's say we draw this, your high is swept over here and your low is swept as well. So that's a ChoCh, right? You have a change of character when the high and lows are swept. ChoCh typically happens when you are basically, let's say price is moving up to a supply zone. You see a ChoCh, which is essentially a bearish ChoCh that tells you that, okay, price is now turning to the opposite direction. So essentially, now that you sort of, I'm sure many of you understand what a ChoCh is. So a lot of you may start out by marking up a lot of ChoChs you see on the chart. Now, if you do that, you sort of get trapped into a endless cycle of which ChoCh is valid, right? Because you have numerous ChoChs, maybe 100 ChoChs in less than a day if you look at the 1 minute, because there's going to be ChoChs everywhere. So let me just, show you an example. You've got ChoCh here. You've got another, probably a ChoCh here. You've got ChoChs everywhere. ChoCh here, ChoCh here. You can mark out a lot of ChoChs. Now, if we're going to be, essentially the way you want to trade and the way you want to use a ChoCh is, I'm going to be using this example of EU, which is a trade I took, and I'm going to be explaining it using this specific method. So, when should you use a ChoCh, right? Now, the only time you should be using a ChoCh is when you are entering a trade, right? So in this example, we had this 10-minute zone here. So this is essentially an intraday play. You have a 10-minute zone here, and we have a mitigation once, and then you want to look for a confirmation entry in that mitigation, right? So drop to the 1 minute time frame, and then I'll slowly, let me just replay it so it's a bit clearer, get rid of the noise. Right, so in this time frame, we essentially, what we had was a 30-second zone here, which also had an inside bar in there, right? So that was a pretty decent zone. Now in this example, what you have here is you have a ChoCh here, right? This is our first change of character that we see in this confirmation entry, right? We have a high swept, we have a low swept, right? This was the first mitigation we had, right? So let me cover, right? If we had a few mitigations in this point, this is a higher time frame zone, and this was the first mitigation. We had first mitigation here on this point, and this was another mitigation which happened on this area. Now this wasn't valid for me because this was news based, right? So on the 30-second time frame, because we're looking to enter a trade here, what we want to look at for our entry, this is a confirmation entry, right? And you could have just taken a trade if you sort of put your chart here, basically put in a risk to reward tool here. You could have your stop loss all the way up there, but we want to be a bit more precise. So in the 1 minute time frame, you could literally mark this candle out, the last inside bar, have your entry in the distal, put your stop loss slightly above, so maybe just about here, 2.5, and take a trade there, right? So in this case, you want to use your ChoCh when you're looking for an entry. Now in this case, we have the first mitigation. We're looking for a confirmation entry. What this ChoCh tells us is, right, now we've mitigated this zone and we want to look for a short, right? Because we're tapping into a supply zone, a confirmation entry here. This ChoCh basically tells us that, okay, from this area here, basically, we can see that, it's pretty much bullish price action, creating high highs, high lows. And this area here tells us that, okay, we have created a higher high here, but we've also basically created a low here by breaking the zones. We had a break of structure, we had a supply zone failing, sorry, a demand zone failing here, and then we had our ChoCh. So this ChoCh tells us that we are basically changing our structural point from a bullish order flow to bearish, right? So essentially, when you want to use your ChoCh is when you're looking for an entry, right? If it's approaching a supply zone, you want to look for a ChoCh that breaks the high and the low, and then you take an entry, because that tells you that the structural point in the market is changing. So you don't want to be marking every single ChoCh out, because that's not going to do anything. you want to be looking for a ChoCh at your entry, because that's when you want to see the market change its bias from bullish to bearish, right? So this is one example of how you want to look for your ChoChs, right? You're going to find a lot of entries. So even if you're taking a scalp, or even if you're taking a swing trade, on your entry point, you want to look for a ChoCh. You want to see price basically give you the right ChoCh, right? Sorry, ignore this. You want to see a ChoCh just like this. Since this is a live example, I thought I'll show you this. Here you can see how, we were approaching this bullish, and then we basically swept highs, swept lows. We filled in our entry, our entry requirements, and this ChoCh was the confirmation that we are turning bearish, right? Now, you should not trade with ChoChs alone, because ChoChs alone do not tell you anything. All they tell you is we are changing our market structure in this specific area here on this time frame. Because if you look on the 10-minute, right, this is nothing, right? We haven't done anything here. We've just mitigated the zone and we're pushing down. There's no ChoCh here, and there isn't any sort of identification or reason that we're changing character on the 10-minute. But if you look at the 1-minute, you have your ChoCh here, right? Because you've had your high sweep and your low sweep. So I'll summarize this before I go on and on explaining this. The only time you want to look for your ChoCh is when you're looking for an entry, right? I'm going to say this again. The only time you look for a ChoCh is when you're looking for an entry. That should be the only time you mark out ChoChs in your chart, and you shouldn't be marking out ChoChs on, the 1 hour time frame and stuff. Sure, you can mark it out, right? But in this case, you could mark out a ChoCh here, maybe like this. But by the time you've seen this ChoCh on the 1 hour, price has already gone down. It's already pushing down. And if you just sort of close this, you could take this 1 hour and then basically take this mitigation, right? But on the 1-minute, it gives you a specific accuracy because you're looking at it from an entry point perspective. That's when you're entering, right? And you want to see the market change at your entry point. Even if it's changing on the 1 hour, it doesn't matter because you're not entering on the 1 hour, are you? However, if you are entering on the 5-minute, the 15-minute, it would be a good idea to see a 5-minute or a 15-minute ChoCh. If for some reason you can't look at the 1-minute to find a ChoCh, that's completely fine. You could still look for a ChoCh on the 5-minute or the 15-minute, but you have to be mindful that the mitigation to the downside could have already finished, and you may not be able to get an entry point at that point, right? So yeah, essentially, I hope you guys sort of understand when we use ChoChs. Use it specifically only for entries, and it is one of our entry requirements. If you don't know what our entry requirements are, have a look at the entry requirement PDF that is in the server, and that will give you a better idea of what our entry requirements are. So I hope you guys understand what I've just explained. If you have any more questions, please feel free to ask, and that will be all for this video.